Hello, my name is Timo, and I'm here to welcome you to the wonderful world of bees. In this presentation, I'm hoping to answer the questions of what is a bee, how do they live, what are some local types of bees, and why are bees important? I figured I'd start us off with some insects that look like bees but aren't, because I feel like bees or bee is a label that can be thrown around for a lot of different insects, that especially ones that are black and yellow or insects that can sting. But bees are actually a specific thing. So we're starting off with insects that look like bees. I'm just gonna reveal what these actually are. So if you want to guess before I do, feel free to pause. 3, 2, 1. This one is a fly, this one is a wasp, and this one is a moth. As far as flies, flies can be hard to tell apart from bees because they're often fuzzy and black and yellow. The reason why flies will look like bees is due to a phenomenon called Batesian mimicry, in which one organism looks like another organism, with one of them not having the defensive mechanisms against predators and the other one having defensive mechanisms against predators. In this case, flies do not have the ability to sting, but bees do. So it is in the best interest of flies to look like bees so that predators are afraid to get stung and won't mess with them. These hoverflies and this bee fly are all flies that get their food from flowers. So hanging out around flowers and blending in with the bees is helpful to them. Bee flies are also a parasite on bees. And robber flies do not eat nectar, but they are predators and will sometimes eat bees. So being able to hang out near bees until the time is right to strike helps them as well. The group of organisms which bees belong to is the order Hymenoptera, which includes wasps, ants, bees, and sawflies. Sawflies are the most primitive of the group, or most closely recognizing or most closely resembling the common ancestor of all of the Hymenoptera. Sawflies are the only ones of this group that don't have the wasp waists, or this tapering in between the abdomen and the thorax that you see in ants, bees, and wasps. They get their name sawfly from their saw-like ovipositor that they use to cut into plants to lay their eggs. Ants, bees, and wasps all have modified ovipositors that they can also use to sting, but sawflies cannot do that. This is a cladogram, which is a diagram that we use to help understand the relationships between organisms. Each of these branching points represents the last common ancestor between two groups. You notice that bees and sand wasps had a more common ancestor, or a more recent common ancestor than ants and bees. You might also notice that the things labeled as wasps on here are pretty distributed amongst branches, where you might notice that wasps, ants and bees are actually a part of that group cladistically, and they're just specialized wasps. Like ants have lost their flight, except in their queens and males, and they have adapted to live underground and be very small. Well, what separates bees from wasps is wasps are mostly carnivorous, feeding their young other arthropods, with sand wasps eating or feeding their young flies, spider wasps feeding their young spiders, and other kinds of wasps eating other kinds of meat. The herbivory of bees is visible in their bodies in the form of their branched hairs. Branched hairs are what we use under the microscope to determine whether or not something is a bee, because they will all have these branched hairs that they use for collecting pollen. The branches help the hair have more surface area for static electricity to attach pollen grains to the hairs. They use these hairs, these patches of hairs, to bring clumps of pollen back to their nests. A lot of bees hold their pollen on their hind legs, and others hold their pollen on the underside of their abdomen. So the different locations of pollen holding can be a tool in bee identification. There are 20,000 species of bees out there, and although the bees that most people are most familiar with, the honeybee and the bumblebee, live in colonies with the queen, that lifestyle is actually exhibited in less than 10% of the total bees, with solitary bees taking up more than 90% of the population of bees that we have. The life cycle of a solitary bee is similar to that of many other insects that go under or undergo complete metamorphosis, such as butterflies. The adults lay eggs in mate and lay eggs in the spring or the summer, depending on the species. Laying eggs in a nest with divided cells for one egg and a clump of pollen and nectar in each. When these eggs hatch, the larva eats that mixture of pollen and nectar to get the energy to develop into a pupa, which will often overwinter and wake up in the spring to emerge as an adult to continue the cycle. Solitary bees usually only live around a year and can either only have one generation per year or have multiple generations per year, in which instead of hibernating, the next round of eggs will hatch into another round of adults to lay eggs until it is time for one of the generations to be one where some hibernation is going on or overwintering. Solitary bee nests can take a lot of shapes and forms. A lot of them live in the ground in tunnels with entrances that look like a small ant nest. Other bees live in cavities in the wood, separating their nest cells with wood pulp or with leaves, depending on the species. There are a lot of different types of nests that solitary bees will make, and it really varies between species. Eusociality is the kind of sociality that is exhibited in honeybees and bumblebees. It's considered by some to be the most advanced form of sociality that exists in animals. It's defined by having separate castes of queens and queens and workers, with the queens being reproductive and the workers being sterile. And with those workers multiple generations of them, helping to raise more workers and future queens. This strategy is found in a few kinds of bees, all ants, some kinds of wasps, such as yellow jackets, in termites, and which are in the eusocial cockroaches, and in the naked mole rat, which is our one uncontested eusocial mammal. Eusociality evolves because of the concept of inclusive fitness, at least in bees, due to males having 1/2 of the amount of DNA that females have, just by some quirk of the math. All of the workers will be the queen, or the workers will have 1/2 of the DNA from their mother, but they will share 3/4 of their DNA with their sisters. So they are evolutionarily compelled to protect the future of their genes with by helping raise future queens that will start their own colonies, because that is an outcome that will spread their genes even more than parenting a child would. So that's the concept of inclusive fitness. And that is also the case in ants, of that math. That is not true of cockroaches and naked mole rats, but it is hypothesized that those the males with 1/2 of the genetics that the females have are an explanation for why eusociality has evolved so many times within the Hymenoptera compared to other groups. Cuckoo bees live a different lifestyle than the other solitary bees or the eusocial bees that we've talked about. Cuckoo bees instead get into the nests of other bees and lay their eggs in already provisioned nest cells. When the solitary bee, or when the cuckoo bee larva emerges, it will eat the pollen that the host bee provided, as well as eating or killing and eating the larva that had been deposited in that nest cell first by the host. Emery's rule is a rule that states that that a lot of insects, their parasites were evolved from the same group as the hosts. For example, this blood bee is really closely related to the sweat bees that it parasitizes, and this lemon cuckoo bumblebee split off from the same kinds of bumblebees that it parasitizes. This rule isn't hard and fast for all cuckoo bees, but it does apply to all of these ones. Starting with the domestic honeybee, I'm going to profile some different species of bees that we have in the area. I have a common name here and a scientific name. Domestic honeybees are the only one of the bees that I'm going to be talking about today that are not native to the Americas or to our areas at all. Domestic honeybees, or the genus Apis, are mostly only found in Asia. The species Apis mellifera actually was in Africa originally, with ancient humans getting honey from it and eating the larva. They were first domesticated by the ancient Egyptians, who selectively bred them to have bigger colony sizes, more honey production, and to tolerate moving into the kinds of artificial nests that we build for them. The ancient Egyptians traded them with the ancient Greeks, and by the time that we were colonizing the Americas, the honey from honeybees and their wax, which is used in candle wax, were essential for the European lifestyle, so they brought them over to the Americas and let them run wild. That's actually not a good thing for our native bees, because honeybees are an invasive species that can be very aggressive to native bees and take up a lot of ecological resources that would otherwise be used by the bees we would normally have. We actually, all of the pollinator services that we need for agriculture could be provided by our native species of bees if we only let them. But the honeybee industry of raising honeybee colonies to pollinate fields is such a expensive in business that a lot of Save the Bees is more of saving the honey industry and the honeybee pollination industry, rather than helping to save the bees that we had here originally, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. Here is the different kinds of honeybees that we have. This is a honeybee worker. This is a honeybee queen. You can see her. She is distinguished by this really long abdomen. And this is a honeybee drone. It might look a little bit more like a fly. It has these really big eyes that it uses to spot females to mate with. Yeah, so that's our domestic honeybee. The other, probably most familiar bee to everyone is the bumblebee. Bumblebees are somewhat similar to honeybees. They are both adapted for the cold with more hair than some other bees have. They both will be out for longer amounts of the year, where most bees are only out for a season. They're both eusocial and they both make honey. The honey that bumblebees make is a little bit more perishable because it is only meant to last for a little bit, because it's meant to feed the queen instead of to be food stores over the winter, the way that honeybee honey is meant to be used. And it's also not as thick and not as sweet, so it's not useful for human consumption. Bumblebees live quite a different life structure than honeybees do, with honeybee queens living for up to 5 years, and bumblebees only living for 1 year. Honeybees have workers that will overwinter with them to keep the nest warm, where none of the honeybees are hibernating. But bumblebees actually live a structure of life much more similar to that of the solitary bee that we talked about earlier, except if you add in the fact that during the adult life of the bumblebee, they will lay a first round of eggs that will be workers. This first round, since they're only provided resources by what the queen can gather on her own, they will be smaller workers. But once this first generation of small workers has been reared, the queen bumblebee can spend the rest of her time laying eggs, and these workers will help raise another generation of workers, as well as males and females that will go on to mate and hibernate. And when those mated females emerge from hibernation, they will start a new hive. So yeah, bumblebees are somewhere in between honeybees and other bees as far as how advanced their eusociality systems are. Bumblebees also live in quite messy nests. They don't have the nice hexagonal nest cells that that honeybees do. They actually just have nests that look more like a pile of little pots that they will have honey and their eggs in, and they are quite messy. And that combined with their perishable honey makes them a little bit more vulnerable to starvation than honeybees are, where in regions of the country where honeybees live, some bumblebees will be avoiding the flowers that honeybees are on, and then the queen will starve, and that will end that colony. So yeah, that's a vulnerability that bumblebees have. Carpenter bees can look very similar to honeybees, not honeybees, can look quite similar to bumblebees. The main differences you'll notice are carpenter bees have this very big, robust head that they use for when they're digging their nests that are holes in the wood. They are grabbing onto the wood with their mandibles and shaking their body, which they need a strong head to be able to accomplish that. So you'll notice their big old head, and you'll also notice their shiny, relatively hairless abdomen that looks quite different in comparison to the bumblebee, which is hairy all over. Carpenter bees will sometimes share nests. This is somewhat common even amongst solitary bees, where this might be a nest entrance where it will branch off in different directions, and at each branch there will be one female bee laying her own eggs, and just sharing a nest entrance. You'll often see male carpenter bees hovering outside these nests because they're very territorial and they want to protect the females from being mated by other males. If I haven't mentioned it yet, male bees cannot sting because the stinger on a ant bee or a wasp is a modified ovipositor or leg-laying organ, which the males don't have, and thus they cannot sting. So if you see carpenter bees hovering around outside the nest, those are probably males, and they're probably pretty harmless. There's another thing that's also called a carpenter bee. These ones are Xylocopa. This one is genus Ceratina. These bees are quite different looking. They're very tiny. Instead of building their nests in wood, they build their nests in stems that have some pith to dig into. Like on plants such as roses and blackberries. Ceratina are solitary, but they have taken one step towards eusociality. They will sometimes lay in or have one daughter that they give less nutrients to, so she ends up smaller and sterile, and she will help the mother maintain the nest and make sure that all of the other eggs make it out fine. And they call this a Cinderella Ceratina because she's doing all the work around the home. But yeah, so then that does make Ceratina an interesting group to scientists who are studying the evolution of eusociality. These are our sweat bees, or the Halictidae. They can come in a variety of colors, such as a metallic black color, shiny greens, blues, purples, reds. These are a pretty varied group of bees. They get their name sweat bees from the fact that they will land on people to drink their sweat for the salt. When they're doing that, they are not doing that to harm you. They just want your sweat, but you should be careful if they land on you, because if you are not paying attention and maybe bend them in your arm or something, they will sting you. Sweat bees are also interesting when it comes to eusociality, because many species are solitary and others are eusocial, where eusociality has evolved and unevolved multiple times within this group, which makes them an interesting case for studying how eusociality evolves. This is a longhorn bee. They get their name from the males, which have these long antennae that you can see in the bottom row of images. This one on the top right is a female, and you can see that her antennae are not as disproportionately long as those of the males. These bees nest in the ground in aggregations, where there are just many different tunnels really close to each other. Only the female bees sleep in their nests. The male bees of most species will sleep outside, often in flowers or hanging onto stems by their mandibles. In these bees, you can often find the males on sunflowers or other flowers that are their preferences. You can find large groups of males sleeping together. Yeah, so that's longhorn bees. One specific kind of longhorn bee that we have a lot of here at Hawthorne Valley are the squash bees. These, you can see the males will sleep inside the squash flowers in groups, just like I was describing from other longhorn bees. Squash bees are specialists, which is when a type of bee will only feed its young pollen and nectar from one specific kind of flower. So that's squash bee with squash. A lot of our native bees are specifically adapted and specialists on specific flowers, but honeybees and bumblebees who go to a lot of different kinds of flowers are called generalists. The leafcutter bee, Megachile, is one of the bees that can be distinguished by having its branched hairs on a different part of its body. These have their hairs on their underside of their abdomen. You can often see them sticking their abdomen up in the air as they collect pollen on flowers. They have a pretty distinct posture. When it comes to bees, you can also see them either cutting and flying away with leaves that they use to line and separate the cells of their nest in cavities in wood. You can find also in your garden, if you see nice circular cuts into the leaves, that's probably the work of a leafcutter bee. Mason bees are pretty closely related to leafcutter bees. They also have their pollen collecting hairs on the underside of their abdomen, but they look pretty different. They're very rounded and can often be pretty blue and metallic. They get their mason name because they use mud to separate the cells of their nests in cavities in the wood. These include, like the Osmia includes the blue orchard bee, Osmia lignaria, which is being used increasingly on farms because it is a more faster and more efficient pollinator of many of our crops. It's also a native bee, so it has a lower environmental impact. And I think that's everything about our Osmia that I remember. Oh, and they also include specialists such as the blueberry bee. That is a specialist on blueberries. Oh, and they also, Megachile are leafcutter bees you usually find in the summer. Mason bees you usually find in the spring. Squash bees are a summer bee. Longhorn bees mostly in the summer. And the rest of these are more year-round. Forgot to mention that as I was going along. These ones are more found in the summer, are sharp-tailed bee, Coleoxys. These ones are pretty distinct. You can tell them apart from other bees by their cone-shaped abdomen that looks quite like a triangle. It also has these little points at the tip in some species. This one doesn't, but they kind of help make their cone-shaped abdomen just look like just a nice triangle shape. They use their pointy abdomens to stab into the nest cells of our leafcutter bees and our mason bees, breaking through the leaves or the mud to lay their eggs. Their larvae have exceptionally big mandibles that they use to kill the host larvae. Yeah, here are our mining bees, our Andrena. These are some of the first bees to come out in the spring. They will sometimes come out as early as February before any flowers that they would pollinate have even emerged or have even started blooming. Mining bees specialize there are many specialists that don't fall within this, but as a general rule, mining bees specialize in plants in the rose family, which include roses, obviously, apples, pears, stone fruit, and many other agriculturally important plants. So mining bees are pretty important. They are one of our ground nesting bees. And yeah, you can see them in the spring. Often the males will be either sitting on the leaves of one particular plant or flying around a particular plant, waiting for the females to come to pollinate that flower so that they can mate with her. And you will often see the females linking up with the males midair, and they'll fall out of the sky while they're mated. It can be quite an interesting sight. Nomad bees are kleptoparasites on mining bees, although they will also parasitize the nests of other ground nesting bees, such as our sweat bees. I forgot to mention this, I think, but Coleoxys follows our Emery's rule that we talked about, where Coleoxys are actually the most closely related group of bees to these leafcutter bees. Nomada do not follow Emery's rule. They are actually more closely related to bumblebees than they are to mining bees or sweat bees. Nomad bees you'll find in spring alongside mining bees hanging around outside their nests. The males will often wait outside of the nest entrances of females, waiting for females to come to mate with her before she goes in to lay eggs in whatever ground nest the species happens to specialize in. And these bees are pretty distinct with their red, black, and yellow coloration and tiny size, where they can look somewhat more like a tiny little wasp than like what you might expect a bee to look like. So why are bees and their diversity important? Bees are the best pollinators. Their branched hairs that they have all over their body help them do a lot of pollination where they are just bringing more pollen from one plant to the next than other insects that land on flowers, such as flies and butterflies, who don't have those branched hairs and thus do not have the same level of pollen sticking to them. And bees also have a sort of etiquette with flowers where they will only go to one species of flower at a time during a trip. So they're only going to be making sure that pollen is getting to the right kind of flower, which is a nice service that they provide for flowers. They also, there are many specialists such as the squash bees, where flowers evolved alongside bees, and many species of bees are the only thing that can correctly pollinate a specific species of flower. So diversity in bees is important for having diversity in our ecosystems, because at the base of our ecosystem, we have our producers, or the plants, and their diversity is important so that we can have diversity on all levels of an ecosystem, and bees help promote diversity in our plants at the very base. So we need them for maintaining our ecosystems. What are some threats to bees? Climate change is pushing many bees out of their natural ranges, as many bees are developed for specific temperatures. Climate change is also, as it messes with weather and causes more chaotic weather events, those can also provide a threat or pose a threat to bee populations, with bees and flowers blooming more out of sync, and bees or flowers emerging or blooming too early to be killed by frost or other things due to false starts with more chaotic weather and warmer temperatures that just throw off the seasonality of all of our animals, but especially ones that need to come out of hibernation at a specific time. Habitat destruction is another big factor. Mass agriculture, urbanization, and deforestation all are limiting potential habitat spots for bees, where there are many species of bees that live in forests and in meadows, where a lot of our land is now being taken up by agricultural land, which is pretty hostile to bees, and also by lawns and in front of houses and manicured lawns at parks, and gardens full of exotic flowers or European flowers, where places for bees to nest and for bees to get the nutritious food that from flowers that they evolved alongside, that kind of environment is harder for them to come by. And they're also threatened by invasive species such as our honeybees and this bee, which is the European wool carder bee. Both of these can be pretty aggressive and take up bee generalists in a way that takes up a lot of ecological space, where our native bees can't compete with them, and that could result in having our whole bee populations be pretty wiped out and mostly have them being represented by one or two species, which would be bad for our diversity of pollinators concept that we were just discussing in the last slide. Invasive species also preferentially will pollinate the flowers that they evolved around and are more natural to them. So honeybees have been known to help promote the spread of invasive plants as well. What can we do? Pollinator gardens can be helpful, just in providing plants that bees will find nutritious, where good pollinator flowers are harder and harder to come by. And good pollinator meadows. Habitat is also important, or just as important as having a garden. Having a place where bees can live near these flowers is important. One way that you can help with that is having a bee hotel, which are these wooden blocks that will have different stems and cut wood pieces with holes in them that bees can build their nests in. You should read up on how to clean them and take care of them, because it's not something to just leave. But if you want, because disease can spread inside of bee hotels if they're unmaintained. But if you keep your bee hotel well, it can be very useful, because the kinds of stems and wood cavities in dead wood that bees would normally live in are often, that wood is removed from forests and from lawns and from meadows and places where bees would find it to live in. So setting up a spot where bees can live can be really helpful, especially if it's near a pollinator garden. And you should also not use pesticides in your personal garden, or even try to not eat from places that use pesticides in their food, because pesticides, as well as killing whatever pests we might not like, kill all insects. They don't discriminate. Where they are killing our bees, and they are killing our butterflies and many other groups of insects that we want around. So I'd recommend, maybe setting up a pollinator garden, setting up some bee habitat, and avoiding using pesticides as things on a personal level. There are also citizen science projects that you can look into for monitoring what bees are in your own lawn. And yeah, there are a lot of resources out there that you can find. So yeah, that's where I'd ask for questions, but I'll just thank you for watching. I'm sorry that this has been a little bit awkward, but yeah, talking to myself in a Zoom meeting is a new experience for me. So I hope you all learned something. Thanks for watching.